Scripture reading today, probably most of you know this, John 21, verses 15 through 17. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to them, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." A second time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter felt hurt because he said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep." There ends the reading.
Good morning, church. So a couple weeks ago, Reverend Lee invited me to speak on the notion of calling and vocation. He also wanted me to share with you all about my current call and vocation. Now, here's the thing. I can't easily explain the last 4 to 5 years of my life within the span of 15 minutes, as even I am to this day still processing all that has happened to me, the people I've encountered, the experience that I've gone through that have shaped me into the person I am now. There's just too many events. Nonetheless, if I am invited to share a testimony with you all today, and were to attempt to share with you how the Spirit has grounded me to this day, I would draw you to this story in John 21. The question, Peter, do you love me? Now, what was the exact context for why Jesus confronted Peter with these questions? Well, if you can recall a couple chapters before this event, we can remember the scenario in where Jesus had been taken captive by the Roman government and was being ridiculed and mocked in the public square. Hundreds of people gathered as Jesus was being humiliated, spat on, and even physically abused. And while all of this was going down, Peter was in the crowd. Not with the crowd in support of what was happening, but just looking at Jesus' suffering from a few feet away. Once people noticed Peter, they pressured him to identify himself as to determine whether or not he was one of Jesus' disciples. Now, let's recall exactly who Peter was prior to these sets of questions. This is Peter who we're talking about, the one disciple who claimed to be this confident, ride-or-die apostle for Jesus. This is the same Peter who had left his job as a fisherman to dedicate his life to Jesus' ministry, not knowing where it would land him. This is the same Peter who was a direct witness to many of Jesus' miracles, and even participated in one as Jesus had invited him to walk on water. This is the same Peter who chopped off the ear of a soldier in an attempt to protect Jesus from being arrested by the oppressive Roman government. And yet, in the end, it is this same Peter who ultimately denied Jesus. Not once, not twice, but 3 times in roughly the span of what could be said a minute, 5 minutes. Even after all the ways in which Jesus poured into Peter and the disciples with love, compassion, and encouragement, this still wasn't enough for Peter to have the willpower to be faithful, even in Jesus' most vulnerable moment. Now, while it may be easy to point a finger at Peter for his shortcomings and think, come on, Peter, you literally had Jesus right there amongst you. You could hold him if you wanted to. How can you doubt? How can you deny? Yet when I personally look at Peter, I can't help but think and say, I totally get you. You're not alone in that feeling, Peter. You see, while I haven't experienced the exact same scenario that Peter was in that day, I do know how Peter must have felt after, denying, leaving Jesus. In fact, we read shortly that he ran crying. I can't help but imagine that Peter experienced shame. Shame for abandoning the person he loved and claimed would do anything for. Having to live with the guilt of neglecting a friend at their gravest moment. Living his life with that mental scar, that memory playing over and over again in his head. Now, what does this depressing detail of Peter's failure have to do with calling? Well, the calling story that I share with you today exhibits some of that emotional toil that to this day I have had to learn to be kind and compassionate towards. I know I've shared my story with a few of you here, but for those who don't know, I had initially stepped away from the church after college. However, prior to leaving the church, you could tell my mom, she's right there, I was one sickly, devoted Christian. Again, sick. This is not healthy what I'm about to share. As a newborn Christian raised in an evangelical conservative culture, I had done anything and everything in an attempt to show God that I was pure and worthy of their love and affection. You see, back then, I believed that to be Christian meant to conform to a certain type of behavior. For example, I stopped cursing for 5 years, and that's no easy task for a high schooler or college student, because, no true Christian would allow such blasphemy to come out of their mouth. I stopped listening to hip-hop, because we all know that that's the devil's tool to lure people into sin and idolatry. I stopped hanging around sinners because they would only deviate me from the narrow path, and that included family and friends. I would partake in fasting in order to rid myself of bodily and worldly desires. I would sense a feeling of inadequacy if I ever skipped a day of reading the Bible. Any type of self-righteous act that you could think of, I would do. All in order to communicate to God how serious I was about my devotion to them. Similarly to how Jesus tried to dedicate and show his commitment to Jesus. In other words, I was that Christian. Yet, that lifestyle crumbled into pieces once I entered college. It was during that time at Cal Poly Pomona that my obsessive religious zeal began to be interrupted by philosophical questions. Now, whether or not we have taken a philosophy class here, we've all stumbled upon these questions at one point or another in our lives, such as, wait a minute, how could I actually express my love to a being, a divine being at that isn't visible or tangible through bodily senses? How do I make sense of God's love for us with all the evil that we see in the world? Does God actually listen to our prayers? And lastly, the question that we all arrive to, does God even exist? I can assure you, church family, that no amount of studying the great thinkers of philosophy and theology would ever be able to fill in that gap that would grant me that 100% certainty that I was trying to find. I was frustrated by that fact. I no longer felt connected to my relationship with God because I couldn't even understand or define who God was. Eventually, I felt like I was deceived and brainwashed into religion. So, what did I do? I jumped ship. I left. On top of that, I was just also fed up with the micro-racial aggressions that I experienced in various white evangelical churches, as well as the hate that these churches would spew against the LGBTQ community. There were just too many jabs that I could no longer endure. And yet, despite leaving for the church sometime, I came upon a realization. You see, no matter where I went into the world, no matter how much I tried to rid myself of having any religious or spiritual ties to Christianity, I couldn't help but think of God. You see, God language surrounded me everywhere I went. I would see God in the media, God in science, God in the morning sun and the fluffy clouds found in the Midwest in the state of Missouri. God as my father would pour water to nurture his plants and hand feed his beloved chickens. God in a warmly cooked meal prepared by my mother. God in the tender hug that I would see my niece give to my older sister as she ran up to her with a grand smile on her face. God in a heart-to-heart conversation with a beloved that I hadn't spoken to in a long time, either due to distance or conflict. I eventually realized I just wasn't a good atheist. So I accepted that fact and realized that, okay, I'm just a religious person, okay? So I had to stop beating myself up and realize that God was everywhere, even though I couldn't define or have certainty of their existence. And for that desire for certainty, I've given it up. I give that to the philosophers to discover. So now we come back. This is a story about call. So what is my call? Or call, any sort of call, in all of this that I've shared? Well, it's all of you. Allow me to explain. I landed here at Covina Community Church back around, I want to say, late 2021, early 2022. And when I came here, I came with many scars and fears. I realized that I had so much built-up shame. And I thought that any type of call that could ever exist would not be able to be present within my life. I felt shame for giving up my relationship with Jesus. I felt shame for mistakes I made along the path that caused pain to others and myself. And again, I felt like any type of call was no longer applicable to my life because, calling comes from God. And up to that point, I had no faith in God. I didn't understand what the word God even meant. Although it wasn't mentioned in today's reading, I'd like to highlight an action of Peter's just moments prior to when Jesus asks him these three questions. You see, that day the disciples had gathered together to go out and fish in the Sea of Galilee. It was in that moment that Jesus had reappeared to the disciples for the third time after his death and resurrection. Once all the disciples had identified Jesus from afar, they all decided to turn the boat around and head back to the shoreline. But Peter acted differently. What did he do? He put on his outer cloak, he jumped into the water, and swam to shore to see Jesus. Now, Peter's actions have traditionally been interpreted as this noble gesture symbolizing Peter's repentance and his dire love and commitment to Jesus, right? However, when I look at Peter as he's swimming back, I see the teenage version of Xavier attempting to do anything he can to prove himself worthy again of God's love and forgiveness, doing the self-righteous acts again, over and over. I can only imagine Jesus looking at Peter as he swims on the shore, thinking, this man still doesn't get it. I'm going to have to confront him about this now. It is then, after breakfast with the disciples, that Jesus puts Peter on the spot and asks him, Peter, do you love me more than these? I could imagine Peter at that moment in his mind thinking, come on, Jesus, didn't you just see that stunt I did for you? I'd swim miles for you if I had to. And what is the response that Jesus gives? Feed my sheep. Immediately after that, Jesus then says again, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" At this moment, I'm thinking that Peter feels embarrassed and awkward now as Jesus asks him this question in front of the disciples. Nonetheless, Peter replies, "Yes, Lord. Come on, you know that I love you." And to this, Jesus replies back, "Okay, tend my sheep." By the third time Jesus asks Peter the third question, I'm thinking that Jesus is wanting to grab Peter by the head and emphasize to him, "Peter, I understand that you love me, but do you love me?" Now this notion of me here, this word, it doesn't limit itself now to Jesus, but is extended to all people. Similarly to how Jesus tells his disciples, "Whatever you did for these people of mine, you did for me." You see, even after all of Peter's self-righteous attempts to try and prove himself worthy of a divine call and blessing upon their life, Jesus humbles Peter, and in the most compassionate way he could communicate to Peter, say to him, "Get off your high horse, Peter, and just come back to the community where you are needed." To me, I understood this message as, "Xavier, the God you claim to see in your father and your mother and your niece and in the awes of the world and its wonders, that's it. That's the call." Church, we do not have to conform to a certain way to be privileged enough to understand our calling. We don't have to jump through these spiritual hoops to see that calling is already in front of us. It's in the people, the sheep that Jesus calls us to look after. It is true, yes, I did go to seminary. And in the back of my mind thinking that, maybe I just needed to unlock this kernel of wisdom. This is all I need. The reason I'm going to seminary is to just unlock that kernel of truth that'll finally help me understand God and the notion of call for my life. When in reality, Jesus was asking me the same question. "Xavier, do you love me? Just come back. Come back to the community." My call was discovered in the midst of the relationships that I have developed with you all in here and those outside who have poured into me and that I have been given the privilege to be able to pour into them. There is no one grand divine call, but there are many small callings that are happening right now in front of you. You are already in the midst of your call, church family. All it requires is that you give attention to this life that you breathe right now at this very moment. May it be so.